Hi and welcome. Have you ever wondered what happens after the happily ever after falls apart? Imagine dedicating 20 years of your life to a man building his dreams, only for him to discard you for a younger model. This is Era's story. She was the perfect wife to a man who became a titan of industry. But one day he decided she was no longer part of his empire. He left her with a settlement and a shattered heart. But what he didn't count on was her resilience. Weeks later, while he was navigating his new flashy life, Ilara was boarding a private jet with a billionaire. Not as a conquest, but as an equal. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a story of redemption. Of rediscovering your power when the world has counted you out. The charity gala was suffocating Claire. It wasn't the press of bodies in the grand ballroom of the pier, nor the cloying scent of 1,000 house roses. It was the weight of her husband's hand on the small of her back, a gesture that looked like affection to the circling photographers, but felt like a brand. Richard Langford loved the theater of their life, the perfect couple, the philanthropic powerhouses, the envy of their rarefied Manhattan circle. Claire, for her part, had long forgotten her lines. She was 45. A fact Richard had begun to mention with the same casual cruelty he might use to point out a scuff on his John Lobb shoes. Her dress, a custom Oscar de la Renta in a shade of sapphire that matched her eyes, felt like a costume. She had chosen it, of course, but the choice had been filtered through a dozen unspoken rules. Was it elegant but not attention-seeking? Flattering but not provocative? Worthy of being Mrs. Langford, darling, Richard murmured, his voice a low thrum against her ear. The Sinclairs are waving. Let's go say hello. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It rarely did anymore. His eyes, once the warm brown of rich earth, now seemed like polished stones, hard and impenetrable. They were constantly scanning the room, assessing, calculating, always looking for the next acquisition, the next advantage. Claire had the unnerving feeling that she too was being assessed and found wanting. For 20 years she had been the architect of their ascent. When they met, he was a scrappy, ambitious analyst with a brilliant mind and a threadbare suit. She was a junior curator at the Met, full of passion for art and history. It was her inheritance, a modest but significant sum from her grandmother, that had provided the seed money for his first venture. She'd managed their home, their social calendar, their life, with the same meticulous care she'd once devoted to cataloging Renaissance pottery. She created the perfect backdrop for his ambition, a serene, elegant world where he could recharge and strategize. She hosted the dinners, charmed the investors, and remembered the names of their children. She was the silent partner, the invisible scaffolding that allowed his empire to touch the sky. Now his empire was a global logistics firm, Langford Worldwide, a name synonymous with ruthless efficiency, and Richard had become a man she barely recognized. The easy laughter they once shared had been replaced by a terse impatience. The nights spent dreaming over cheap wine had become silent dinners, where the clink of silverware was the only conversation. Richard, a word. A man with a predatory smile and the sleek look of a hedge fund manager clapped Richard on the shoulder. Richard's hand dropped from her back. Of course, Robert Clare, darling. You know the drill. Mingle. He turned away without a backward glance, swallowed by a sea of black tuxedos. Mingle. It was a command, not a suggestion. For a moment, Claire stood frozen, a statue in a sea of motion. She watched him, the way he commanded the space around him, the easy confidence in his posture. He was in his element. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. She saw the younger women in the room, women in their late 20s and early 30s, with bodies honed by personal trainers and faces untouched by time or worry. They looked at Richard with a hungry, acquisitive gleam in their eyes. They were the new crop of potential acquisitions, and for the first time a cold dread, sharp and specific, pierced through the dull ache of her loneliness. She made her way to the bar, her smile a carefully constructed mask. "A glass of champagne, please." As the bartender poured, a woman sidled up next to her. It was Margot Kingsley, a fellow charity board member whose husband had traded her in for his yoga instructor 2 years prior. Margot's eyes, shrewd and sympathetic, took in Claire's flawless exterior. "He's on the prowl tonight," Margot said, her voice low. It wasn't a question. Claire's mask didn't slip. "He's always networking." "That's not the kind of networking I'm talking about, honey." Margot took a sip of her gin martini. "I saw him with Sienna Caldwell earlier, the one who does PR for half the tech startups in the city. She's 28 and looks like she was assembled in a lab for the sole purpose of making the rest of us feel obsolete." Claire's heart gave a painful lurch. Sienna Caldwell. She knew the name. Richard had mentioned her, praising her aggressive, forward-thinking strategies. She was everything Claire was not. Young, hungry, and utterly of the moment. "Richard respects her work," Claire said, the words tasting like ash. Margot gave her a look that was a mixture of pity and exasperation. "Claire, wake up. Men like Richard don't respect work from women like that. They see a commodity, a shiny new toy. I'm just saying, watch your back." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and meaningless conversations. Claire played her part, the gracious, elegant wife. But Margot's words had been a stone thrown into the still, stagnant waters of her denial. Every time she saw Richard across the room, he seemed to be laughing a little too loudly, his hand lingering a little too long on a woman's arm. He was performing, but this performance wasn't for their shared benefit. It was for him. Later that night, in the sterile silence of their penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, the pretense finally crumbled. The space, decorated in shades of gray and chrome, felt as cold and impersonal as a hotel lobby. It was Richard's taste, not hers. Her love for warm woods, rich textiles, and the beautiful, imperfect patina of antiques had been dismissed as cluttered and dated. She was taking off her diamond earrings when he walked into the bedroom, loosening his tie. "Good event," he said, his tone clipped. "We raised over $2 million. "That's wonderful," she replied, her voice hollow. He looked at her, then really looked at her. And his expression was one of profound, weary disappointment. "You look tired, Claire. It was a long night." "No, it's not just tonight." He sat on the edge of their king-sized bed, a vast empty space between them. "It's all the time. There's a sadness about you. It's draining." The accusation hung in the air, a stunning piece of cruelty. He was the source of her sadness, the architect of her loneliness. And yet, he was blaming her for it. It was the emotional equivalent of an accounting trick, shifting a liability off his own books and onto hers. "I'm not sad, Richard," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know what I am." "That's just it," he said, standing up and starting to unbutton his shirt. "You don't know what you are anymore. You've let yourself go, not physically, but in spirit. The fire is gone." He was describing a problem he had created. A fire he had systematically extinguished with years of neglect and quiet contempt. He was building a case. She realized, not for a reconciliation, but for a departure. The foundation of their life, the one she had so carefully constructed, was being systematically dismantled, and she was the last to know. She felt a tremor of fear, but beneath it, something else stirred, a flicker of long-dormant anger. The gilded cage had been comfortable, but she was starting to remember what it felt like to want to fly. The end came not with a bang, but with the quiet, deliberate click of a briefcase latch. It was a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the gala. The day was deceptively ordinary. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their apartment, glinting off the sterile surfaces. Claire was arranging white tulips in a minimalist vase, a small act of rebellion against the apartment's cold aesthetic. The flowers were a whisper of the woman she used to be. Richard walked into the room already dressed in a bespoke suit of sharkskin gray. He wasn't heading to the office. He carried the briefcase, a sleek, weapon-like thing made of carbon fiber. He placed it on the glass dining table with a soft thud that echoed the finality of a gavel. "CLA," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was his boardroom voice, the one he used for hostile takeovers. "We need to talk." Her heart, which had been in a state of low-grade anxiety for weeks, began to pound a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She turned from the flowers, her hand still holding a single white tulip. "Okay, I'm not happy," he said as if this was a novel revelation. "I haven't been for a long time. And neither have you." It was the same tactic he'd used in the bedroom after the gala, presenting his decision as a mutual one, a kindness. He was not abandoning her. He was liberating her. The gaslighting was so profound, so audacious that for a moment she almost believed him. "What are you saying, Richard?" she asked, though she already knew. The words hung in the air, a script she was forced to follow. "I'm saying this isn't working." He gestured vaguely at the opulent space around them. "This life us, it's become a performance, and I'm tired of the stage." "So you're just ending it?" The tulip stem in her hand snapped, a sound that was shockingly loud in the quiet room. 20 years. You're just ending it on a Tuesday morning? There's no good day for this, Claire. For the first time, a flicker of something. Annoyance, impatience, crossed his face. He was a man used to efficiency. He had allocated a specific amount of time for this unpleasantness, and she was disrupting the schedule. "I'm trying to do this with dignity for both of us." He opened the briefcase. Inside, nestled in custom M-cut foam, were not papers, but a series of neatly bound documents, each tabbed and labeled. It was an execution planned with the meticulous detail of a corporate merger. "I've had my lawyers draw up a separation agreement," he said, pushing a thick document across the table. "It's generous, more than generous. The apartment is yours. A lump sum settlement of $20 million plus a monthly stipend of $50,000 for the next 5 years. All assets in your name remain yours. It's clean. No fuss. $20 million. The number was obscene, designed to stun her into silence, to buy her compliance. It was a fraction of his net worth, she knew, but to him it was a king's ransom, a golden gag. He was purchasing her silence, her quick and quiet disappearance from his life. Generous, she repeated, the word tasting like poison. She looked at his face, searching for a trace of the man she had married, the boy who had sketched out his dreams on a napkin in a dingy diner, while she looked on with shining eyes. There was nothing. That man was gone, replaced by this cold, polished stranger. "And what about my contribution?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "The 20 years of my life, the inheritance I gave you to start your first company. Is that factored into your generous calculation?" He sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "Claire, don't be sentimental. That was a long time ago. Business is business. This is a fair deal. The best you'll get." The unspoken threat was clear. "Take it or I'll drag you through a legal battle that will strip you of everything, including your dignity." He knew she would never do that. He was counting on her grace, her breeding, her aversion to making a scene. He was using the very qualities he had once claimed to admire as weapons against her. Then came the final brutal blow. "I've met someone," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "It's Sienna Caldwell. I'm sure you've heard of her. She understands the world I live in now. She's dynamic. She challenges me." She's 28, Claire thought. The words a silent scream in her mind. She's a new shiny model, and I'm the old one being traded in. The betrayal was so profound, so cliché, it was almost laughable. He hadn't just left her. He had replaced her with a younger, sleeker version of the ambition that had once been their shared dream. The pain was a physical thing. a white-hot agony that started in her chest and spread through her limbs, leaving her cold and numb. She felt the blood drain from her face. She sank into one of the ridiculously expensive, uncomfortable dining chairs, the legal document, a tombstone on the table before her. "I want you to be out of the apartment by the end of the week," he continued, his voice brisk, now that the unpleasant part was over. "I'll be staying at the Carl. Sienna and we're going to be traveling for a bit. It's better if we make a clean break." He was not just leaving her. He was erasing her. He wanted her gone, out of sight, so he could install his new life in the space she had occupied. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it finally broke through her shock. A laugh escaped her lips. A dry, ragged sound. "You want me out of my home?" "It's for the best," he said, closing the briefcase. The deal was done. He stood up, adjusting his tie. He looked at his watch. He was already moving on. He walked to the door, then paused, his hand on the handle. He looked back at her, a small, almost imperceptible frown on his face, as if he was disappointed in her reaction. He had expected tears, perhaps, or a dignified silence. This raw, broken sound of her laughter was an untidy loose end. "Sign the papers, Claire," he said, his voice softening into a parody of concern. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. It's time to move on." And then he was gone. The door closed with a quiet, expensive click, sealing the tomb of their marriage. Claire sat alone in the sun-drenched room. The white tulips drooping in their veins, the $20 million contract lying on the table like a death certificate. She was 45 years old, and her life had just been declared obsolete. The silence he left behind was absolute. The first few days were a blur of disbelieving numbness. The apartment, once a symbol of their success, became a mausoleum. Every object was an artifact of a life that was no longer hers. The art on the walls, chosen by committee and approved by Richard, felt alien. The books on the shelves, mostly unread tomes on business and economics, mocked her. She wandered through the silent, cavernous rooms like a ghost, touching the cold marble countertops, the smooth leather of the sofas, her reflection, a pale, shimmering stranger in the polished chrome. She didn't cry. The shock was a dam holding back a flood of grief, and she was terrified of what would happen if it broke. Instead, a cold, methodical anger began to set in. Richard had given her a deadline, out by the end of the week. It was a final assertion of his power, a last twist of the knife. He expected her to crumble, to have her assistant pack her things, to disappear quietly. On the third day, she woke up with a new steely resolve. If he wanted her out, she would get out. But she would not be erased. She would conduct an archaeological dig of her own life, and she would decide which artifacts were worth saving. She started in the back of his closet, a vast climate-controlled space that smelled of cedar and money. She bypassed his rows of identical suits and shoes and went for the boxes on the top shelf. Inside one, she found them. Old photo albums, the kind with sticky pages and plastic film. The first picture was of her and Richard on their honeymoon in a small sun-drenched village in Italy. He was 29, his hair longer, a goofy love-struck grin on his face. She was 25, her eyes full of a hope so fierce it made her ache to look at it now. She sat on the floor, the album spread around her, and for the first time the tears came. They were not the wild, hysterical sobs she had feared, but a slow, silent cascade of grief for the woman in the photographs. That woman had believed in love, in partnership, in forever. She had poured all of her intelligence, her passion, her very soul into this man, and he had taken it all and then declared it worthless. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She mourned not just the end of her marriage, but the loss of her own identity. For 2 decades she had been Mrs. Richard Langford. Her own name, Claire Whitmore, felt foreign on her tongue. Who was she without him? The question was a terrifying abyss. She had no career to return to. She had given up her curatorial ambitions to support his. Her friends were their friends, couples who orbited in Richard's universe. Would they remain loyal to her? Or would they, like her husband, trade her in for a more valuable connection? The power imbalance of their relationship was suddenly starkly, brutally clear. He had a corporation, a new life, a future. She had a settlement check and a past. He had systematically isolated her, making her dependent on him, not just financially, but socially and emotionally. It was a masterful long-term strategy, and she had been too blind, too trusting to see it. After hours spent on the floor of the closet, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, the grief began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear anger. It was a clean, purifying rage. He would not break her. He would not erase her. She called a moving company. Not one of the high-end firms Richard used, but a smaller local outfit. She didn't want the polite, deferential pity of his people. She wanted men who would just do the job. Then she began to pack. It was a brutal cleansing process. She was not just packing boxes. She was making choices. The Oscar de la Renta dress from the gala. She left it hanging in the closet, a sapphire ghost for Sienna to find. The expensive minimalist furniture Richard had chosen. She told the movers to leave it. The art, it could stay. She packed the photo albums. She packed the worn paperbacks of her favorite novels, the ones she had hidden in her bedside table like contraband. She packed the small chipped ceramic bowl she had bought on her first trip to Greece long before Richard. She packed a box of her old research notes from her time at the Met, her handwriting a reminder of a woman who had her own passions, her own intellect. Each object she chose was a breadcrumb leading back to herself, to Claire Whitmore. Her lawyer, a sharp, nonsense woman named Andrea Clean, advised her to sign the papers. "It's a clean break, Claire," she said over the phone. "Fighting him will get you nothing but a mountain of legal fees and public humiliation. He'll paint you as a bitter, greedy ex-wife. Take the money and build a new life. It's the best revenge." Claire knew she was right. Richard had insulated himself perfectly. So with a hand that trembled only slightly, she signed the document. That legally severed her from the life she had built. She was no longer Mrs. Langford. The day the movers came, the apartment was a chaotic mess of boxes and packing paper. It was a fitting visual for the state of her life. As the men worked, she made one last stop. She went to her jewelry box. She took out the engagement ring Richard had given her, a massive, flawless diamond that had once been her pride and joy. It now felt like a shackle. She also took out the simple gold locket her grandmother had left her. She walked into the kitchen and found the number for a reputable jeweler. She made an appointment for that afternoon. By evening, the apartment was empty of everything that was truly hers. The movers were gone. She stood in the soulless, silent space, her purse in her hand, ready to leave for the last time. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an old friend, one from before Richard's time, who had heard the news. "I'm so sorry, Claire. If you need anything, a place to stay, a shoulder to cry on, I'm here." Another buzz. It was a news alert from a financial publication. The headline read, "Richard Langford, CEO of Langford Worldwide, announces strategic partnership with Caldwell PR. Sources say the relationship is personal as well as professional." The article included a picture of Richard and Sienna clinking champagne glasses on a yacht. The very picture of a power couple, seeing them together, so smug, so triumphant, should have destroyed her. But as she looked at the picture, something shifted. The pain was still there. A deep, resonant ache. But it was no longer the all-consuming agony of the past few days. It was something she could contain. She looked around the apartment one last time. It was a beautiful, expensive prison, and she was finally free. She had the settlement, yes, but more importantly, she had the contents of those boxes. She had the memories of the woman she had been and the quiet, fierce determination to become someone new. She walked out the door and didn't look back. The archaeology was complete. It was time for the restoration to begin. For the first month, Claire lived in a state of suspended animation. She took a suite at the Lelle, a hotel that was the antithesis of her former home. It was warm, intimate, and deeply traditional with chintz fabrics, wood-burning fireplaces, and a quiet old-world charm. It was a place to hide, to lick her wounds in luxurious privacy. She spent her days in a fog of grief and aimless wandering. She would walk for hours through Central Park, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, watching families, lovers, the entire pageant of human connection, feeling utterly detached from it all. She visited the Met, her old stomping grounds, but found she couldn't enjoy the art. Each painting, each sculpture was a reminder of the passion she had sacrificed. The $20 million sat in her new bank account, a sterile, intimidating number. It was her freedom, her security, but it also felt like blood money, the price of her silence. The monthly stipend felt like an allowance, a continued tether to Richard, a reminder of her dependency. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, she found herself seeking refuge in a small independent bookstore in the West Village, the kind of place Richard would have dismissed as unprofitable. The air smelled of old paper and brewing coffee. It was a haven of quiet intellectualism, a world away from the glossy, high-stakes universe she had just escaped. She was running her fingers over the spines of art history books, a section she hadn't allowed herself to visit in years, when a voice beside her said, a fellow enthusiast of the Florentine masters. "I see." The voice was deep with a warm, pleasant timbre and a faint, unplaceable European accent. She turned. The man standing next to her was tall, perhaps in his early 50s, with silvering hair at his temples and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was dressed in a simple, impeccably tailored gray sweater and dark trousers, an outfit of quiet, understated elegance. There was a stillness about him, a sense of calm authority that was nothing like Richard's restless, aggressive energy. "I used to be," Claire replied, her voice rusty from disuse. "A long time ago." "A passion like that doesn't die," he said, his gaze both curious and kind. "It just goes dormant." He gestured to the book she was touching, a monograph on the sculptor Donatello. "His David is a masterpiece of youthful arrogance and divine purpose. Don't you think?" His observation was so astute, so specific, it caught her off guard. It was the kind of conversation she hadn't had in years. Richard's interest in art was purely financial, an asset class. He spoke of artists in terms of their auction records, not their souls. "I've always been more partial to his Mary Magdalene," she found herself saying, surprised by her own engagement. "The wooden one in the Duomo. It's so raw, so full of pain and repentance. It's brutally human." A slow smile spread across the man's face, transforming his handsome, serious features into something approachable and warm. "An excellent choice. It's a work of profound psychological insight. Most people prefer the beauty. You chose the truth." They stood there for a moment, a comfortable silence falling between them, the shared appreciation for a piece of art creating an unexpected intimacy. "I'm Alexander," he said, extending his hand. "Alexander Morrow." His handshake was firm, his hand warm. "Claire Whitmore," she replied, using her maiden name. It felt good, solid. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Claire Whitmore." He didn't seem to recognize her name. Or if he did, he gave no sign. In Richard's world, everyone knew who she was, or rather what she was, Mrs. Langford. Here in this dusty bookstore, she was just a woman with an opinion on Donatello. It was intoxicating. They talked for nearly an hour, their conversation flowing easily from Renaissance sculpture to modern architecture. To the simple pleasure of a rainy day in New York, he was witty, Intelligent, and most importantly, he was a phenomenal listener. He asked her questions about her opinions, not as a social nicety, but with genuine interest. He looked at her when she spoke, his gaze focused and attentive. She felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. She learned that he was in the city for business, though he was vague about the details. He spoke of living in London, but traveling frequently. There was an air of mystery about him. But it wasn't the secretive, guarded mystery of Richard. It was the quiet confidence of a man who had no need to broadcast his own importance. "I'm afraid I have a meeting to get to," he said finally, a look of genuine regret in his eyes. "But I can't help but feel our conversation is unfinished." Claire's heart gave a nervous flutter. She had forgotten what this felt like, this spark of connection with a new person. "Perhaps," he continued, his tone casual, but his eyes intent, "you would allow me to continue it over dinner tomorrow evening." The invitation was so direct, so refreshingly devoid of games that it startled her. Richard's courtship had been a strategic campaign. This felt human. I'd like that," she said, a genuine smile reaching her eyes for the first time in weeks. He smiled back, a crinkle of fine lines appearing at the corners of his eyes. "Excellent. Shall we say 7 o'clock? There's a quiet Italian place nearby, Il Buco. Do you know it?" She did. It was known for its authentic, unpretentious food. The kind of place Richard would never go. "I do. It's lovely, perfect." He pulled out a simple, elegant business card. It bore only his name, a phone number, and an email address. No company name, no title. "In case your plans change," he gave her a small, almost courtly nod. And then he was gone, leaving the scent of rain and expensive cologne in his wake. Claire stood for a moment, her fingers tracing the embossed letters of his name on the card. Alexander Morrow. She bought the book on Donatello. As she walked back to her hotel, the rain had stopped and a sliver of sun was breaking through the clouds. The city, which had felt so gray and hostile, suddenly seemed full of possibilities. For the first time since Richard had walked out of her life, she felt a flicker of something that was not grief, not anger, but a tentative, fragile hope. She had a dinner date. It was a small thing, a single step, but it was a step out of the past and into the unknown. And for the first time in a long time, the unknown didn't feel terrifying. It felt like an adventure. The contrast between Richard and Alexander was a study in two different kinds of power. Richard's power was loud, ostentatious, and demanding of validation. It was in the logos on his private jet, the brash headlines he courted, the way he entered a room as if he owned it. Alexander's power was a quiet gravitational force. It was in the way the maître at Il Buco greeted him not with feigned deference, but with genuine warmth and respect, leading them to the best, most secluded table in the house. It was in the way he spoke with a calm assurance that needed no embellishment. Their dinner was a revelation for Claire. She had spent 2 decades calibrating her conversation to Richard's moods and interests, carefully editing herself to be the perfect sounding board for his ambitions. With Alexander, she found herself talking, really talking, about things she hadn't thought about in years. Her passion for provenance research, her dream of visiting the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, her controversial theory about a misattributed painting in a minor Italian museum. Alexander listened with an intensity that was both flattering and unnerving. He didn't just hear her words. He engaged with her ideas. "That's a fascinating hypothesis," he said, his chin resting on his hand, his stormy eyes alight with interest. "Have you written about it?" "No," she admitted, a flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. "It was just a theory I was developing before I got married." "Ashamed to let good ideas go to waste," he said simply, without a trace of judgment. But the words landed with the force of a quiet manifesto. "Ashamed to let your life go to waste." He spoke of his own life in broad, intriguing strokes. He was in private equity, a term that could mean anything. But he spoke of it not in terms of hostile takeovers and profit margins, but in terms of finding and nurturing potential. "I like to find undervalued assets," he explained. "Companies with good bones that have been mismanaged or overlooked, and help them become what they were always meant to be." The parallel was not lost on Claire. She felt like an undervalued asset, a company with good bones that had been brutally mismanaged. As the evening wore on, she found herself telling him about her divorce. She didn't intend to. The words just came, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a simple statement of fact. She kept the details sparse, editing out the rawest, most humiliating parts. She was the ex-wife of a prominent businessman. They had grown apart. It was over. Alexander listened without interruption, his expression unreadable but attentive. When she finished, he didn't offer the empty platitude she had come to expect. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or his loss. Instead, he looked at her and said, "It must be difficult when your life's work is a partnership, and the partnership is dissolved. You're left with the question of what your work is worth on its own." The insight was so precise, so deeply empathetic. It took her breath away. He understood that her grief was not just for the loss of a husband, but for the invalidation of her life's work. He saw her not as a jilted wife, but as a professional who had been the victim of a hostile buyout. Meanwhile, Richard's new life was playing out in the glossy pages of tabloids and on gossip websites. He and Sienna were a whirlwind of conspicuous consumption. They were photographed on a yacht in St. Bart's. Sienna in a microscopic bikini, Richard looking tanned and virile. They were at the opening of a new club in Miami, at a film festival in Cannes. He was buying her extravagant gifts: a rare pink diamond, a limited edition Ferrari, a penthouse apartment in a new soulless glass tower. He was spending money, the only currency he truly understood to prove his happiness. But in the photos, Claire saw something she hadn't noticed before: a flicker of desperation in his eyes. His smiles were too wide, his grip on Sienna's arm too tight. He wasn't living a new life. He was performing one. And the performance looked exhausting. Sienna, for her part, looked triumphant. She was the ultimate accessory, the living proof of his continued relevance and power. Claire's relationship with Alexander unfolded at a different pace, measured in a different currency. Conversation, shared experiences, mutual respect. They went to museums, obscure chamber music concerts, and tiny family-owned restaurants in Queens. He was reintroducing her to the city she lived in, but had never truly known. More importantly, he was reintroducing her to herself. One afternoon, he took her to a private gallery in Chelsea. The owner, a chic woman with an intimidatingly severe haircut, greeted Alexander with a kiss on both cheeks. "Alexander, darling, it's been too long." She led them to a private viewing room. On the wall was a single stunning painting, a landscape that was both abstract and deeply emotional. "It's a recent acquisition," Alexander said to Claire. "I wanted your opinion before I finalized the purchase." Claire was flawed. He wasn't just asking for her opinion as a casual date. He was consulting her as an expert. She walked up to the painting, her old instincts kicking in. She studied the brushstrokes, the use of color, the composition. She spoke for 10 minutes, her voice sure and confident, dissecting the artist's technique and emotional intent. When she was finished, Alexander and the gallery owner were looking at her with expressions of profound admiration. "Well," the owner said, raising an eyebrow at Alexander, "she's better than half the consultants I have on my payroll. Where did you find her?" Alexander just smiled. "I found her admiring the truth in Donatella." On the way out, he turned to her. "I have a proposition for you. I have a rather extensive art collection, and frankly it's a mess. It's poorly catalogued, and I suspect some of the attributions are optimistic. I need someone with a good eye and a passion for the truth to sort it out. It's a massive project. It would require travel to London, Geneva, my home in Tuscany. It wasn't a date. It wasn't a handout. It was a job offer. A serious, demanding, important job. It was a lifeline, a chance to reclaim the part of herself she had thought was lost forever. "I'm not asking for a favor," he said, his eyes serious. "I would pay you your market rate, of course. I need the best. I think that's you." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of overwhelming, bone-deep relief. He was offering her a new currency, one based not on a settlement check from her ex-husband, but on her own talent, her own worth. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alexander, I would love to." That evening she went back to her hotel suite and opened her laptop. She began to research the art market, auction records, and cataloging software. The fire that Richard had declared extinguished was not gone. It had just been dormant, and Alexander Morrow had just handed her a match. The next 3 months were a blur of purposeful activity. Claire moved out of the hotel and into a beautiful light-filled apartment in a pre-war building on the Upper West Side, a place she chose for herself, filled with things that she loved. It was a home, not a showroom. The $20 million, which had once felt like a burden, now felt like a tool. She used it to hire a top-tier financial advisor, a woman who specialized in helping divorced women secure their futures. For the first time, Claire took control of her own finances, learning the language of investments and portfolios, a world Richard had always kept shrouded in mystery. But her real work, her true salvation, was Alexander's art collection. It was, as he had said, a magnificent mess. He had been buying for years with a good eye, but little discipline. It was a dragon's hoard of treasures, disorganized and unappreciated. The project was a perfect fit for Claire's meticulous academic mind. She flew to London, where Alexander had a stunning townhouse in Belgravia filled with British modernists. She spent weeks in his villa in Tuscany, a rambling ancient stone house surrounded by olive groves, cataloging his collection of Renaissance drawings. She worked with a focus and intensity she hadn't felt in years. She was not just an employee. She was a partner in this endeavor. Alexander trusted her judgment implicitly. They would have long conversations over dinner, debating the merits of a particular artist, the history of a specific piece. Their relationship deepened, evolving from the tentative spark of a new romance into the solid, load-bearing structure of a true partnership. He was not just her lover and her employer. He was her friend, her champion, her intellectual equal. He never pushed for more intimacy than she was ready to give. He seemed to understand that she was not just recovering from a divorce, but from a trauma. He gave her space, respect, and unwavering support. The power imbalance that had defined her marriage to Richard was non-existent with Alexander. Theirs was a relationship of equals, each bringing their own strengths to the table. The culmination of her work was to be an unveiling of sorts. Alexander was a major benefactor of a small prestigious museum in London. He had agreed to loan a significant portion of his collection for a special exhibition, an exhibition that Claire herself would curate. It was her professional debut, a chance to step out from the shadows and claim her own name in the art world. The opening night was a glittering affair. The gallery was filled with the elite of the London art scene, critics, collectors, and fellow patrons. Claire, dressed in a simple but elegant black gown, felt a tremor of nerves, but it was the exhilarating fear of a performer stepping onto the stage, not the dread of a prisoner being led to the gallows. Alexander stood by her side, a quiet, reassuring presence. He looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated pride. "You did this, Claire," he murmured, his hand finding hers. "This is all you." She was in the middle of a conversation with a critic from the Times who was praising her bold, revisionist pairings when she saw him. Richard, he was standing near the entrance, looking utterly out of place. He was with Sienna, who was wearing a dress that was too tight, too bright, too loud for the understated elegance of the London art world. She looked like a cheap imitation in a room full of originals. Richard's eyes were fixed on Claire, and his expression was one of stunned disbelief. He had obviously read about the exhibition. He had come, she realized with a jolt, to witness her failure. He had expected to find her pathetic and broken, a sad, lonely divorce, clinging to a new man for support. He had not expected to find her in her element, confident, respected, the center of attention, not as an accessory, but as the architect of the entire evening. Their eyes met across the room. The shock on his face was quickly replaced by a dark, possessive anger. It was the look of a man who had discarded a possession, only to see it displayed in a museum, suddenly priceless. He started to move towards her, a predator stalking his prey. Sienna scurried to keep up, a look of confusion and annoyance on her face. Alexander, sensing the shift in her demeanor, squeezed her hand. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. The fear she would have once felt was gone, replaced by a cold, calm resolve. She was no longer his possession. She was no longer afraid of him. "Claire," Richard said, his voice a low growl as he reached her. He ignored Alexander completely. "What is all this?" "It's an art exhibition, Richard," she replied, her tone cool and level. "I curated it. You," he scoffed, a hint of his old dismissive cruelty in his voice. "Since when are you a curator?" "Since I decided to reclaim my life," she said. Before he could respond, the critic from the Times interjected. "Your wife has done a masterful job, mister." He looked at Richard with a dismissive air. "Her ex-husband," Claire corrected gently. "Richard Langford." The critic's eyes widened slightly in recognition, but his expression soured. Richard's reputation for ruthless business practices was well known in London. Sienna, feeling excluded, stepped forward and thrust out her hand. "Sienna Caldwell," she said, her voice a little too loud. "I handle all of Richard's public relations." The critic gave her a limp, brief handshake and turned back to Claire. "Well, Miss Whitmore, you have a remarkable eye. The juxtaposition of the bacon and the Sutton is inspired. I'd love to discuss it further for my review." The dismissal was absolute in this world, a world of culture, intellect, and quiet power. Richard's money and Sienna's aggressive PR meant nothing. Claire's talent, her knowledge, her passion, that was the currency that mattered here. Richard's face was a mask of fury. He had come to see her humbled, and instead he had been humiliated. He had been rendered irrelevant in her new world. He looked from Claire, poised and respected, to Alexander, who stood beside her, a silent, powerful guardian. He saw the easy intimacy between them, the shared language of equals. And in that moment, he understood what he had lost. It wasn't just a wife. It was the quiet, steady foundation of his own success, the one asset he had undervalued and discarded, and which was now clearly beyond his reach. He turned and stalked out of the gallery, dragging the bewildered Sienna behind him. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it was a seismic shift. The power dynamic had been irrevocably, publicly reversed. Claire watched him go, not with triumph, but with a sense of quiet closure. The final shackle had been broken. She was free. Richard's retreat from the London gallery wasn't the end of the matter. It was the beginning of his obsession. The public humiliation, the sight of Claire not just surviving but thriving, had lit a fire in him. It wasn't love or even remorse. It was a toxic cocktail of wounded pride, possessiveness, and a dawning, terrifying realization that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had seen Claire not as a partner, but as a part of his portfolio, an asset he had liquidated. Now he saw that asset appreciating in value in another man's hands, and his predatory instincts kicked in. He wanted her back, not because he missed her, but because he couldn't stand the thought of someone else having her. His life with Sienna was beginning to show its cracks. The initial thrill of her youth and ambition had worn thin, replaced by the grating reality of her shallowness. Their conversations were a loop of gossip, brand names, and social media metrics. She wasn't a partner. She was a high-maintenance accessory who required constant validation and an endless stream of cash. He had thought he was upgrading, but he had merely traded a classic handcrafted Rolls-Royce for a flashy leased sports car that was proving to be incredibly expensive to maintain. He began a campaign to win Claire back. A campaign conducted with the same ruthless, tone-deaf strategy he used in his business dealings. It started with text messages, sentimental drill about their shared past, conveniently forgetting the brutal manner in which he had ended it. "Remember that little cafe in Florence? I was thinking about that today. Heard our song on the radio. Made me smile." Claire ignored them. They were like spam, intrusive and irrelevant. Then came the gifts. A massive bouquet of her favorite pies arrived at her apartment with a note. "I made a mistake." A first edition of a book she had always wanted. Tickets to the opera. Each gift was a calculated move, an attempt to buy his way back into her life. She donated the flowers to a local hospital and gave the book and tickets to her doorman. His desperation escalated. He started calling, leaving long rambling voicemails. He would alternate between Lynn's sentimentality and flashes of his old, arrogant self. "I miss you, Claire. I miss what we had." Followed by "This man you're with. He's not right for you. You belong with me. We built an empire together." He didn't seem to understand that he had built an empire and she had been relegated to the service entrance. The final, most audacious gambit came a few weeks later. Claire was in her apartment working on the catalog for Alexander's collection when her intercom buzzed. It was Richard. He was in the lobby. "Let him up," she said, her voice calm. She was not afraid. She was just tired of him. She wanted to end this once and for all. When she opened the door, he looked terrible. He was impeccably dressed as always, but there were dark circles under his eyes and a frantic, haunted look about him. "Claire," he said, his voice thick with a manufactured emotion. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about, Richard." "Please," he said. And for the first time, she heard a note of genuine desperation. He was a man drowning, and he was grasping for the life raft he had willingly set adrift. She let him in. He stood in the middle of her living room, a space that was so completely her, filled with warm colors, comfortable furniture, and books. It was a world he didn't belong in. "I've left Sienna," he announced, as if this was the magic key that would unlock her forgiveness. "That's between you and her," Claire said, unmoved. "It has nothing to do with me." "It has everything to do with you," he insisted, his voice rising. "I left her for you. I realize now what a fool I've been." She was nothing. A diversion. "You, Claire, you are my life. You are my home." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. He was trying to sell her the same fantasy he had sold Sienna. The idea that she was the one, the only one, while the previous one was not yet a distant memory. "I am not your home, Richard," she said, her voice like ice. "You demolished that home. You sold the land to a new developer. And now that the new building has turned out to be a poorly constructed condo with a leaky roof, you want to come back and claim the original property. But the property is no longer for sale." His face contorted in a mask of rage and disbelief. He was not used to being told no. He was used to getting what he wanted. "Is it him?" he snarled. "Is it Morrow? What did he offer you? More money? A bigger title? What's his price? I'll double it." And there it was. The core of him laid bare. Everything was a transaction. Everyone had a price. He could not conceive of a world in which a woman would choose respect over money, partnership over ownership. "You still don't get it," she said, a profound sadness washing over her. She almost felt sorry for him. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own making, a world devoid of genuine human connection. Alexander didn't offer me anything. He saw me. He saw the person I was, the person I could be. When you only saw a line item on your balance sheet, an asset that had depreciated in value. She walked to the door and opened it. "You need to leave, Richard." He stared at her, his mind scrambling, trying to find a new tactic, a new angle, but there were none left. He had played all his cards. "You'll regret this, Claire," he whispered. A final pathetic threat. "No, Richard," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "I won't. My only regret is that I didn't leave you sooner." He walked out, a defeated man. As the door closed, Claire felt a sense of profound peace. It was over. The last ghost had been exorcised. She was no longer defined by her relationship to him, not as his wife, not as his ex-wife, not even as the object of his desperate, pathetic regret. She was simply Claire Whitmore, and her future was her own. A week later, Claire was standing on a private tarmac at Tetro Airport. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and violet. In front of her, gleaming under the twilight, was a Gulfstream G650, its engines humming a low, powerful song of promise. Alexander was waiting for her at the top of the stairs, his hand outstretched. He was flying them to Tuscany for the weekend to his villa, the place where she had first begun to piece her life back together. But this time she was not going as his employee. She was going as his partner. As she walked up the stairs, she thought about the last time she had been on a private jet. It had been Richard's, a flying monument to his ego, emblazoned with the Langford Worldwide logo. She had always felt like a passenger on those flights, a piece of high-end luggage being transported from one of his properties to another. She took Alexander's hand. His grip was warm and steady. He smiled at her, a smile that reached his eyes and made her feel like she was the only person in the world. Inside the jet was the epitome of understated luxury. There was no gold plating, no ostentatious logos, just soft cream leather, polished dark wood, and the quiet hum of a perfectly engineered machine. "Ready for our adventure?" he asked, as he led her to a seat. "I am," she said. And the words were truer than any she had ever spoken. As the jet taxied down the runway, her phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Richard Langford sells penthouse at a loss amidst rumors of financial trouble. The article detailed how his reckless spending, coupled with a few bad investments and the costly separation from Sienna, had put a significant dent in his fortune. He was downsizing, selling off his toys, his empire shrinking. She read the headline and felt nothing. Not pity, not satisfaction, not even a flicker of interest. His fate was no longer tied to hers. It was just news about a stranger. The jet accelerated, pressing her back into the soft leather of her seat. She looked out the window as the ground fell away, the lights of the city shrinking to a glittering carpet below. She was rising above it all, literally and figuratively. Alexander poured them both a glass of champagne. "A toast," he said, his stormy eyes soft in the warm light of the cabin. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," she repeated, clinking her glass against his. They talked as the jet climbed through the clouds, the sky turning from deep indigo to a black velvet strewn with diamonds. They talked about the future, about the exhibitions they would plan, the places they would see, the life they would build together. It was a conversation between equals, a blueprint for a shared future, not a hostile takeover of her own. She had once believed that her life was over, that her worth was tied to a man who had declared her worthless. She had been trapped in a gilded cage, a beautiful prison of someone else's design. But she had found the key. The key was not Alexander, not his money, not his lifestyle. The key was herself. It was the rediscovery of her own passion, her own intellect, her own strength. Alexander had not saved her. He had simply opened a door and invited her to walk through it on her own 2 feet. As the coast of America disappeared behind them, and the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic opened up before them, Claire felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. She was not the woman who had been left for a younger model. She was not the woman who had cried on the floor of her husband's closet. She was Claire Whitmore, a curator, a partner, a lover, a woman who had faced the ruin of her life and had chosen to rebuild. Not from the ashes, but from a stronger, more authentic foundation. She leaned her head on Alexander's shoulder, the hum of the engines a lullaby. She was flying private, not with a billionaire who had bought her, but with a man who valued her. And she was flying towards a future that was not a settlement, but a reward, a future she had earned, a future that was finally gloriously her own. Claire's journey is a powerful reminder that our worth is not determined by who we are to someone else, but by who we are to ourselves. She lost everything she thought defined her, only to find the person she was always meant to be. Her story is one of betrayal, yes, but more importantly, it's one of resilience, of reclaiming your power, and of the quiet triumph of building a life on your own terms. It proves that sometimes the most devastating endings are just the beginning of a much better story. If Claire's story of redemption and empowerment resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of incredible transformations and second chances. Thank you for watching.